here with Hank, and we're going to be talking about Uberlaufen here to make a point that not all doubles, as we would normally call them, not all doubles are created equal. In fact, we should not define everything as a double. Here's the case in point. If Hank were to do an Unterhau to me, the prescription essentially in the Hauptstube, the chief elements, is to do an overrunning, an Uberlaufen. So it looks like this. As the Unterhau comes in, avoid going towards their sword and simply cut towards their head. Take a look at this. Now the image for Sigmund Ringek in the Glasgow manuscript is the sword is at the elbow here, the other person's at the shoulder. This is the image in Glasgow. Now if you look at this image, in modern HEMA practice we would say, well wait a minute, this is clearly a double. I've hit Hank here, Hank has hit me here, that's a double. But we have to consider that the masters are saying, no, that's not a double. In fact, this is what you're supposed to do when someone cuts an Unterhau from Zufechten, mind you. This is a really important piece of the context. If Hank's trying to lay on and he cuts an Unter from Zufechten, this is my response. Now, if you notice, I'm sure you can see it on camera, his eyes went straight to my sword, and the reason is we have no masks or helmets on. And so think about how this would look in the 15th century, 16th century, if we have no masks on, maybe a gambeson, and these are sharp. What's going to happen is Hank's going to want to re-engage with this sword. So as he cuts his Unterhau, and I do this, he's going to do that. Do you see? He's going to change the target from me to the sword. The masters know this because this is the historical context in which they're in. Very different from our own. We get completely geared up, and an Unterhau comes, we try to do an Uberlaufen, and we get this, right? And we hit each other, that's a double. No, it's not a double. In fact, the one doing the overrunning, the Oberhau, which can also be a thrust, by the way. It's mentioned you can thrust. So here's the variation mentioned in both Pseudo Van Danzig and Uberlaufen. Mentions this way, as the Unterhau comes in, set the point on his face. So all you're doing is what Meyer might call a plunge cut becomes a thrust to the face. And it's the same result. Right? Hank's going to want to re-engage. He has no desire to keep that point at his face. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that in our modern practice, because we're geared up, we oftentimes accept all doubles as things to be thrown out. We need to work through them differently, but that's not the case. All doubles are not created equal. And so we have to understand, given the historical context, given the fact that we have less gear on, we have no fencing masks, these things are sharp, completely changes the mindset as to how you're going to react to, let's say, an Unterhau in this way. Moreover, if the other person re-engages because they've cut an Unter and they see that the threat is to their head and they re-engage, Uderlev and Pseudo Van Danzig both say all you need to do is use the long edge now to overrun their sword further, to get over top. And here you have an advantage. This doesn't mean you win, but you're now going to leverage that long edge to either wind on them, to bring it to a Utirin, right, to come down to actually thrust. The point is to get that long edge on top. So there's no double there whatsoever. If they want to go for your arm while you go for their head, you win that fight. And it's important that we recognize that doubles are not made equally. They're not all equal. Here's another example, by the way. If we have our normal bind that we always work from, right? And I get an overbind here, my sword's here. Oftentimes you'll see this where there's a wrenching, and as I come off and go towards Hank's face, he'll just go towards my middle section, right? Without even, see, that's a good idea to wind up, but don't do that. As I do this, he just brings it across my middle. And we count this then as a double. Well, wait a minute. If this is the historical context we're supposed to be reconstructing, and I'm in just a gambeson, no fencing mask, Hank is the same, there's no way this is the double. I'll let him strike towards my gambeson torso all day long as I come straight down on his head. So when we spar in our modern reconstruction, and we have all that gear on, and there's a clear advantage from this moment, the person who uses this advantage to hit is the winner. We have to stop judging this as, it's a double. That's not true. The historical sources are very clear on the principle of once you have an advantage with your sword and cut high, you win. And the Uberlaufen is the perfect example of where the masters in fact say that. Do you have anything you want to add, Mike?
I mean, I've run into that so many times where like you kind of have that advantage and you're going for that, especially with the center, you're going for a thrust and people will just come off, and so it's frustrating. But yeah, I also think with the protective gear and a lot of just the light work you do with masks and heavy gloves, you do get conditioned to just take hits on the head and not really consider that it's supposed to be a sharp sword that's going to do some damage.
Right. Right. So it's a good point, right? So we get conditioned even in our modern practice to take those wallops on our fencing mask and just ignore them because we're all friends, hopefully, and we want to remain friends, and we're not trying to clobber each other, right? But understand the historical context is much different from what our modern context is, and that's a good point. Cool. Take care.